The admission committee of Zinthri Prime Academy had made what they would later call the greatest mistake in galactic educational history, or perhaps the greatest breakthrough, depending on who you asked and how many of their facilities were still standing. Dr. Vexthani, the headmaster, stared at the holographic display showing the incoming student roster for the new semester. His four eyes blinked in sequence as he processed the information. Among the usual collection of promising young minds from across the galaxy, the brilliant Zephyrians with their crystalline intellects, the logical Vrex with their perfect mathematical reasoning, the empathic Solari who could sense emotional disturbances from 3-star systems away, was a single entry that made his respiratory slits flutter with concern. Species: human. Homeworld: Earth. Classification: Deathworld inhabitant. The application had somehow slipped through 17 different screening processes, 12 psychological evaluations, and 6 different safety committees. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the transportation shuttle was already en route, and galactic admission laws prevented them from turning away any student who had legitimately qualified for acceptance. Maya Chun was 19 Earth years old, which translated to roughly the same age as most incoming students across species, though the exact conversion made most alien mathematicians develop headaches. She had scored in the 99th percentile on the Universal Aptitude Assessment, demonstrated remarkable problem-solving skills, and showed an unusual talent for what the evaluation termed adaptive survival thinking. What the evaluation had failed to mention was that adaptive survival thinking, when applied by a Deathworld species, tended to produce solutions that other species found deeply disturbing. The shuttle bay of Zinthri Prime Academy was a marvel of engineering, designed to accommodate the arrival of students from dozens of different worlds with varying atmospheric requirements. Environmental shields created perfect bubbles of homeworld conditions as students disembarked. The aquatic Delphians emerged in their mobile water suits. The silicon-based lithoids clanked forward in their heavy environmental armor, and the energy-based Luxians flickered in their containment fields. Maya stepped off the human-compatible section of the shuttle wearing nothing more than a simple jumpsuit and carrying a single duffel bag. She breathed the station's atmosphere without assistance, walked normally in the artificial gravity that was considered standard across most of the galaxy, and looked around with the kind of casual interest that suggested she found nothing particularly challenging about her environment. This was the first sign that something was different. Professor Kethvari, a tall, graceful Etherean whose species had evolved on a world where the greatest natural disaster was the occasional gentle breeze, had volunteered to serve as Maya's orientation guide. She approached the human student with the kind of cautious optimism that educators brought to particularly challenging students, her luminescent skin patterns shifting to colors meant to convey welcome and peaceful intentions. "Welcome to Zinthri Prime Academy," she said, her translator rendering the musical tones of her native language into what she hoped was comprehensible human speech. "I am Professor Kethvari. I will be helping you adjust to life here." Maya looked up at the professor's 8-foot frame and smiled. It was, Professor Kethvari would later report, the kind of smile that showed far too many teeth and suggested that the human found something amusing about the situation. "Thanks, Professor. I'm Maya. This place is incredible." As they began the tour, Professor Kethvari pointed out the various safety features that made Zinthri Prime Academy suitable for such a diverse student body. Emergency containment fields in case of atmospheric breaches, gravity adjustment systems, temperature control zones, medical facilities equipped to handle the unique biology of hundreds of different species, and redundant safety systems that could lock down any section of the academy in case of emergency. Maya nodded along politely, but Professor Kethvari noticed that the humans' attention seemed to be focused on entirely different aspects of their environment. While the professor pointed out the emergency exits, Maya was studying the structural support beams. When they passed the medical facility, Maya's eyes lingered on what appeared to be a basic maintenance panel. During their stop at the dining facility, while Professor Kethvari explained the complex nutritional requirements and dietary restrictions that the academy accommodated, Maya was examining the kitchen equipment with the kind of interest that suggested she was mentally cataloging every item that could potentially be repurposed. The academy prides itself on maintaining a completely safe environment, Professor Kethvari explained as they entered the residential section. In over 3,000 years of operation, we have never had a single student injury requiring more than minor medical attention. Maya's eyebrows rose slightly. Never. Never. Our students come from worlds where survival challenges simply do not exist in the way they do on. Professor Kethvari paused, consulting her notes. Deathworlds. Violence is unknown to most of our species. Physical conflict is a concept that exists only in historical texts and theoretical studies. Maya looked around the corridor, noting the delicate architectural elements. The large windows made of what appeared to be decorative rather than protective material, and the general absence of anything that could remotely be considered a defensive measure. That's really something. The dormitory room that had been assigned to Maya was a marvel of comfort and convenience by galactic standards. Atmospheric controls, gravity adjusters, a bed that could be configured to accommodate the sleeping preferences of over 200 different species, a personal food synthesizer, and entertainment systems that could access the cultural databases of the entire known galaxy. Maya set down her single duffel bag and looked around. The room was larger than the apartment she had shared with 3 other students back on Earth, and contained technology that represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. She walked to the window, which provided a spectacular view of the Academy grounds stretching out toward the horizon under the light of Zinthari Prime's triple suns. Is everything satisfactory? Professor Kethvari asked. The question was routine, but she found herself genuinely curious about the human's response. Most students from advanced civilizations still required some time to adjust to the Academy's systems, even when those systems were superior to what they had known on their home worlds. It's perfect, Maya said, and the professor was surprised to realize that the human actually meant it. There was no disappointment that the room lacked some specific comfort from her home world, no confusion about how to operate the systems, no requests for modifications or adjustments. The human had simply accepted the space as it was and declared it adequate. Professor Kethvari left Maya to settle in with instructions about where to find the dining facility, the library, and the location of her first classes the following day. As she walked back through the corridors of the academy, she found herself thinking about the human student. There had been something unsettling about their interaction, though she could not quite identify what it was. It was not until several hours later, as she was reviewing Maya's file in preparation for the next day's classes, that Professor Kethvari realized what had bothered her. Every other student who arrived at the academy, regardless of their species or the advancement of their civilization, showed some sign of being impressed by what they encountered. The technology, the scale of the institution, the diversity of species, the resources available. Something always caught their attention and provoked a reaction of awe or wonder. Maya had looked at everything with the calm assessment of someone conducting a security evaluation. That night, as the academy settled into its quiet evening routine, Maya sat at her window looking out at the grounds. The triple suns had set, and the artificial lighting system created a gentle, even illumination that was designed to be soothing to as many species as possible. She could see other students moving about, some in groups, others alone, all of them clearly feeling safe and secure in their environment. She opened her duffel bag and began unpacking. Basic clothes, personal hygiene items, a small collection of books that she had refused to trust to the digital systems that might not be compatible with human technology, a few personal mementos, and, wrapped carefully at the bottom of the bag, a basic multi-tool that would have been considered primitive by galactic standards, but which represented the kind of versatile, reliable equipment that no human with any sense would travel without. Maya held the multi-tool in her hand and looked around her luxurious, comfortable, completely defenseless room. Tomorrow, she would attend her first classes at the most prestigious educational institution in the galaxy. She would meet her fellow students, brilliant minds from species whose worlds had never known war, predation, natural disasters, or any of the countless challenges that made survival on Earth an ongoing test of adaptability and resourcefulness. She wondered how long it would take before someone realized that admitting a Deathworlder to their perfect, peaceful academy might have been an oversight. Outside her window, the academy's gentle lighting system dimmed gradually to simulate natural nightfall. and Maya settled in to get some rest. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. Maya's first class was applied physics, taught by Professor Thexdal, a crystalline whose species had mastered theoretical science through pure mathematical elegance. The crystalline approach to physics was based on the principle that the universe operated according to perfect logical principles that could be understood through careful observation and rational analysis. The classroom was a masterpiece of educational design, with holographic projectors that could create three-dimensional models of complex phenomena, comfortable seating that adjusted automatically to accommodate different body types, and environmental controls that maintained optimal learning conditions for all species present. 23 students from 16 different species sat in carefully arranged groupings that took into account their various social, environmental, and educational needs. Maya took a seat toward the back, noting that most of the other students seemed to regard her with a mixture of curiosity and caution that suggested word of the Deathworlder's arrival had already spread through the academy. Professor Thexdal began the class with a theoretical problem that had been carefully designed to challenge students' understanding while remaining firmly within the bounds of established scientific principles. The problem involved calculating the orbital mechanics required to establish a stable research station in the complex gravitational field surrounding a triple-star system. The students approached the problem methodically, working through the mathematical equations and consulting their personal data devices for reference information. The Zephyrian students formed a small discussion group and attacked the problem through collaborative analytical thinking. The Vrex student worked alone, processing the calculations with the kind of mathematical precision that made their species natural engineers. The Solari student seemed to be approaching the problem through some form of intuitive understanding that Maya could not quite follow. Maya looked at the problem, made some quick mental calculations, and raised her hand. Professor Thexdal's crystalline structure flickered in what Maya would learn was the equivalent of surprise. Yes, student Maya? The station design assumes normal operational parameters, right? Like, this is meant to be a place where researchers can work safely for extended periods. That is correct. The research station must provide a safe, stable environment for long-term occupation. Maya nodded thoughtfully. Because if you're just trying to establish a platform that can maintain position and function for a reasonable period of time, you could skip most of the stability calculations and just use controlled orbital decay to manage the gravitational stresses. The classroom fell silent. Professor Thexdal's structure flickered more rapidly, which Maya was beginning to recognize as a sign of either intense thinking or alarm. Student Maya, could you elaborate on what you mean by controlled orbital decay? Well, instead of fighting the gravitational anomalies, you work with them. Set up the station so that it gradually falls toward the most stable gravitational source while using that energy to power the systems that keep it operational. You'd have to evacuate and rebuild periodically, but the engineering requirements would be much simpler, and you'd get useful energy output from the process. The silence in the classroom had taken on a quality that Maya was starting to recognize as distinctly non-human. It was the kind of complete stillness that occurred when predators were near, except these students had never evolved with predators and did not understand why their instincts were suddenly screaming warnings. A Delphian student, whose species was known for their careful, methodical approach to problem-solving, spoke up first. But the station would be destroyed. The researchers would lose their work. The investment in construction would be wasted. Maya looked genuinely confused. Yeah, but you'd get several years of useful data before that happened, and you could design the evacuation protocols to save the most important research. It's not like you'd lose everything. And the energy output during the decay phase could power additional research projects. A Solari student's chromatic patterns were shifting rapidly through the spectrum, indicating emotional distress. You are suggesting that we plan for the destruction of the facility, that we accept the loss of the station as an inevitable part of the design. I mean, everything gets destroyed eventually, Maya said, her tone suggesting that she was stating something so obvious that she was surprised it needed to be mentioned. This way, you just control when and how it happens so you can get the maximum benefit from the process. Professor Thexdal had managed to stabilize their crystalline flickering, though the light patterns were still noticeably agitated. Student Maya, your approach demonstrates creative thinking. However, the standard solution involves establishing permanent stability through careful gravitational mapping and the use of compensatory thrust systems. Right. But that would require massive energy expenditure for the thrust systems, ongoing maintenance, and constant monitoring. Plus, if anything goes wrong with the systems, you lose everything instantly instead of having a controlled decline that gives you time to respond. Maya paused, looking around the classroom at the faces of her fellow students. The expressions were difficult to read across species barriers, but the body language was universally tense. I mean, the permanent solution is fine if you have unlimited resources and perfect maintenance capabilities. But if you're working with realistic constraints, planned obsolescence with energy recapture seems more practical. The rest of the class proceeded in a subdued atmosphere. Professor Thexdal presented the standard solution to the orbital mechanics problem, which involved elegant mathematical calculations and sophisticated technological systems that would maintain the research station in a stable position indefinitely, assuming optimal conditions and regular maintenance. The students nodded along and took notes, but Maya noticed that several of them kept glancing in her direction with expressions that she could not quite interpret. After class, a small group of students approached Maya as she was gathering her materials. The group was led by HFY, one of the Zephyrian students whose species was renowned for their analytical thinking and collaborative problem-solving abilities. Maya, HFY said, their translator rendering their crystalline voice tones into careful human speech. We wanted to ask you about your approach to the orbital mechanics problem. Sure, Maya said, shouldering her bag. What did you want to know? Your solution assumes that destruction is acceptable, that loss is inevitable. This is... HFY paused, consulting with the other students in rapid exchange of their native harmonics. This is not how we approach problems. Really? How do you approach problems? A lithoid student, whose rocky exterior was shifting through mineral patterns that Maya was learning indicated thoughtfulness, spoke up. We seek optimal solutions, permanent solutions, solutions that create stability and eliminate risk. Maya considered this. But that's not really possible, is it? I mean, everything changes eventually. Stars burn out, planets shift orbits, technology becomes obsolete. Trying to create permanent solutions just means you're not prepared for when things inevitably change. The group of students exchanged more rapid communications in their native languages. Maya caught a few fragments through her translator, but most of the conversation was happening too quickly for the translation software to keep up. Finally, HFY spoke again. Maya, may we ask what your home world is like? Earth? It's... Maya paused, trying to think of how to describe her home world to species that had never experienced what galactic civilization termed a death world. It's challenging. The climate changes constantly. There are natural disasters, predators, diseases, resource scarcity. Most of human history has been about adapting to circumstances that we couldn't control. And this is considered normal on your world? Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we've gotten better at predicting and preparing for challenges, but the basic idea is that you have to be ready for things to go wrong and have backup plans when they do. The Solari students' color patterns had settled into what Maya was learning indicated deep thought. This explains your approach to the orbital mechanics problem. You naturally think in terms of managing failure rather than preventing it. I guess so. I mean, preventing failure is great when it's possible, but it's usually not possible forever. So you plan for how to handle failure when it happens and try to get as much benefit as you can from the process. The students exchanged more glances, and Maya got the distinct impression that she had just provided them with information that they found both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Maya's next class was xenobiology, taught by Dr. Melthara, a Sylvani whose species had evolved from plant-like organisms on a world where cooperation and symbiosis were the primary survival strategies. The class was studying ecosystem management, specifically how to maintain the delicate balance of life support systems on space stations and colony worlds. The problem presented to the class involved a colony world where the introduced ecosystem was experiencing periodic population crashes among the primary food species. The standard approach involved careful monitoring of population levels, supplemental feeding programs, and genetic modification to increase the stability of the food species. Maya listened to the discussion, took notes, and waited until Dr. Melthara asked for alternative approaches. You could introduce predators, Maya suggested. The classroom fell silent again. Maya was beginning to recognize this as a pattern. Dr. Melthara's leaf-like structures rustled, and what Maya would learn was the Silvani equivalent of confusion. Predators, student Maya? The population crashes are happening because the food species don't have natural population controls. They breed until they exhaust their resources, then die off massively. Predators would maintain constant selective pressure and keep the population at sustainable levels. A Vrex student, whose species approached problems through rigorous logical analysis, spoke up. Predators would kill the food species. That would reduce the food supply for the colonists. Some of them, yeah. But they'd kill the weak ones first, which would improve the overall health of the population. And they'd prevent the boom and bust cycles that are causing the periodic crashes. You'd have fewer total animals during peak times, but you'd have reliable numbers all the time. Dr. Melthara was rustling more extensively now. Student Maya, predation involves death, violence, the consumption of one life form by another. Maya looked around the classroom, suddenly realizing that she was dealing with species that had never evolved with predation as a natural part of their ecosystems. Right, but that's how population balance works. Death is part of the system. If nothing dies, everything dies when the resources run out. The Silvani professor was now rustling so extensively that Maya worried she might have caused some kind of medical emergency. Student Maya, perhaps you could explain how predation functions on your home world. Maya spent the next 20 minutes describing the basics of Earth's food webs, predator-prey relationships, and the role of death in maintaining ecological balance. The class listened with what could only be described as horrified fascination. Several students requested clarification on concepts that seemed impossible to them. That animals would actively hunt and kill other animals for food. That death was a regular and expected part of natural systems. That competition and conflict were driving forces in evolution. When Maya finished her explanation, the classroom was silent for several minutes. Finally, Dr. Melthara spoke. Student Maya, what you are describing this is not how life functions elsewhere in the galaxy. Really? How does life function elsewhere in the galaxy? Through cooperation, symbiosis, mutual benefit. Life forms work together to support each other. Death is rare, and violence is not part of natural systems. Maya considered this information. But then, how do populations stay in balance? How do species adapt and evolve? How do you deal with resource limitations? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the class period came to an end. As Maya left the classroom, she found herself surrounded by the same group of students from her physics class, now joined by several others who had apparently heard about the Deathworlder's unusual perspectives. They walked with her toward the dining facility, maintaining a careful distance that suggested they found her both fascinating and potentially dangerous. Maya, HFY said as they entered the dining area, we have been discussing your contributions to today's classes. Oh, what about them? Your solutions, they involve destruction, death, conflict. These are concepts that most of our species have never encountered except in historical databases. Maya selected her food from the synthesizer, marveling briefly at technology that could produce a perfectly nutritious meal from raw elements in a matter of seconds. And that's working out for you? I mean, no offense, but it seems like you might be missing some useful approaches. The dining facility had grown quiet as word of the conversation spread. Maya found herself at the center of attention from dozens of students representing species from across the galaxy, all of them staring at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to alarm. A senior student, a luminary whose species communicated through controlled light emissions, approached the group. Are you the Deathworlder? They asked, their light patterns shifting through sequences that Maya's translator indicated were associated with both respect and caution. I'm from Earth, if that's what you mean. We have heard that your species evolved on a world where survival required constant struggle against hostile forces. That's not exactly wrong, I guess. Although constant struggle makes it sound worse than it is. It's more like constant adaptation. Things change, challenges arise, you figure out how to deal with them. The luminary's light patterns shifted to what Maya was learning indicated deep thought. And this has shaped how your species approaches problems. Probably. I mean, I can't really compare it to anything else since Earth is the only world I've ever known. But, yeah, we tend to assume that things will go wrong eventually and try to be ready for it. And you consider this normal. Maya looked around the dining facility, taking in the faces of students whose species had never known war, predation, natural disasters, or scarcity. I'm starting to think that maybe normal is relative. The conversation continued through dinner, with students asking Maya increasingly detailed questions about life on Earth. They wanted to know about weather patterns that could kill, animals that hunted humans, diseases that spread through populations, natural disasters that could destroy entire cities. They asked about human responses to these challenges, military organizations, emergency response systems, backup plans, redundant infrastructure. With each answer, Maya could see the students becoming more troubled. The concepts she was describing were not just foreign to them. They were fundamentally incompatible with how their species had evolved to understand the world. As the evening wound down and students began returning to their dormitories, HFY approached Maya one last time. Maya, they said, your presence here is educational, but also concerning. Concerning how? You think about destruction as normal. You plan for failure as inevitable. You see conflict as natural. These are not concepts that we are equipped to understand or deal with. Maya nodded slowly. And I'm starting to realize that you've never had to understand or deal with them. Your worlds, your species, your entire civilization has evolved without the challenges that shaped humanity. Yes, and we are wondering, what does this mean for the Academy? For our education? For our future? Maya looked out the windows of the dining facility at the Academy grounds, beautiful and peaceful under the artificial lighting system. I don't know, she said honestly. But I think we're all about to find out. As Maya walked back to her dormitory, she found herself thinking about the day's events. She had attended 2 classes and inadvertently introduced concepts that had deeply disturbed her fellow students. Her approaches to problem-solving, which seemed natural and obvious to her, were apparently revolutionary and frightening to species that had never learned to think in terms of controlled destruction and managed failure. Tomorrow, she had advanced engineering and interspecies relations. She wondered what kinds of problems those classes would present and how her fellow students would react to the solutions that seemed obvious to someone whose species had spent millennia learning to survive in a universe that was constantly trying to kill them. Back in her room, Maya opened her multi-tool and began making notes about the Academy's layout, security systems, and emergency protocols. Not because she expected trouble, but because preparation for trouble was as natural to her as breathing. Outside her window, the Academy settled into another peaceful night, unaware that its 3,000-year record of perfect safety was about to be tested by the presence of someone whose species had never had the luxury of assuming that safety was permanent. Maya's 3rd day at Zinthri Prime Academy began with what the administrative systems logged as a routine atmospheric processing malfunction. The Academy's environmental controls detected a minor fluctuation in the oxygen-nitrogen balance in the eastern residential wing, and standard protocols initiated a temporary lockdown of the affected area while automated repair systems diagnosed the issue. For 99% of the Academy's students, this meant spending a pleasant morning in their dormitories while the systems resolved what was clearly a minor technical issue. The Academy's 3,000-year safety record was built on precisely this kind of careful, methodical approach to potential problems. Identify the issue, isolate the affected area, allow the automated systems to work, resume normal operations once optimal conditions were restored. Maya woke up to the sound of her room's atmospheric monitoring system announcing in calm, soothing tones that temporary environmental restrictions were in effect and that normal activities would resume shortly. She checked her personal data device and found a message from the Academy administration explaining that a minor atmospheric processing issue was being resolved and that students should remain in their rooms for their safety and comfort. Maya read the message twice, then walked to her window and looked out at the Academy grounds. She could see students in other wings moving about normally, attending their morning classes, completely unaffected by what was obviously a localized issue. She checked her atmospheric readings and confirmed that her room was maintaining perfect environmental conditions. Then, she opened her multi-tool and began hacking the Academy's information systems. This was not because Maya distrusted the Academy's assurances that everything was under control. After 3 days of classes, she had developed enormous respect for the technological sophistication of galactic civilization. Their automated systems were marvels of engineering, their safety protocols were comprehensive, and their approach to problem-solving was methodical and thorough. But Maya had been raised on a world where minor technical issues could escalate into life-threatening emergencies in minutes, where waiting for official updates could mean waiting too long, and where personal responsibility for safety meant gathering as much information as possible as quickly as possible. The Academy's security systems were designed to prevent unauthorized access by species whose approach to information gathering was based on polite requests and patience for official responses. They were not designed to prevent unauthorized access by someone whose species had spent millennia developing increasingly creative ways to obtain information that others preferred to keep secret. Maya's multi-tool was primitive by galactic standards, but it had been designed by humans for humans, which meant it had capabilities that the Academy's security programmers had never considered necessary to defend against. Within minutes, she had accessed the Academy's internal monitoring systems and was reviewing real-time data on the atmospheric processing malfunction. What she found made her swear in 3 different human languages. The atmospheric processing malfunction was not minor. The Eastern Wing's environmental systems had not experienced a routine fluctuation. A cascade failure in the primary atmospheric recycling plant was causing oxygen levels to drop steadily throughout the wing, while nitrogen compounds built up to dangerous concentrations. The automated repair systems had been attempting to compensate for 12 hours, and were falling further behind with each cycle. The Academy's environmental systems had been designed with multiple redundancies and fail-safes, but they had been designed for an institution whose students came from worlds where atmospheric composition was stable, where emergency situations developed slowly, and where the concept of cascading failure was purely theoretical. The systems were sophisticated enough to handle any single point of failure, but they had never been tested against the kind of rapid deterioration that characterized emergency situations on Deathworlds. Maya accessed the Academy's emergency protocols and discovered that the standard response to environmental system failures involved isolating the affected area, notifying students that temporary restrictions were in place, and allowing automated systems to resolve the issue. The protocols included provisions for evacuation if automated systems failed to restore normal conditions within 72 hours. The current atmospheric readings indicated that the students in the Eastern Wing had maybe 6 hours before oxygen levels dropped to dangerous levels, and possibly 3 hours before nitrogen compound concentrations became toxic. Maya tried to contact Academy administration through official channels to report her findings. The communication system politely informed her that due to the ongoing environmental situation, official communications were limited to emergency messages only, and that students could expect regular updates through official channels as the situation developed. Maya tried to access the Academy's emergency alert system to broadcast a warning. The system required administrative authorization that she did not have. Maya tried to contact Professor Kethvari, Dr. Melthara, or any of the faculty members she had met. The communication system informed her that faculty members were currently in meetings regarding the ongoing environmental situation and were not available for student consultations. Maya looked at her atmospheric readings again. Oxygen levels in her room were still optimal, but her readings from the environmental systems indicated that the automated repair efforts were not just failing. They were making the situation worse by drawing resources from backup systems that were now also beginning to fail. She made a decision that would have been obvious to any human, but was incomprehensible to species whose worlds had never required rapid individual response to emergency situations. She was going to fix the problem herself. Maya grabbed her multi-tool, activated her room's emergency override systems, and stepped into the corridor. The air immediately hit her as thin and acrid, confirming that her remote readings had been accurate. She could breathe, but she could tell that the atmospheric composition was degrading. The corridor was empty. Academy safety protocols had locked down the residential wing and instructed students to remain in their rooms where environmental systems could maintain optimal conditions for each species' requirements. This approach made perfect sense for species whose emergency responses were based on collective action and administrative coordination. It was potentially fatal for a situation that required immediate individual action to prevent systematic failure. Maya accessed the Academy's engineering schematics through her multi-tool and began making her way toward the Atmospheric Processing Center. The route took her through sections of the Academy that were increasingly affected by the environmental breakdown. Emergency lighting had activated in several areas, indicating that power was being diverted from non-essential systems to support environmental controls. She passed other students' rooms and could hear sounds of distress from several species whose atmospheric requirements were more stringent than those of humans. The aquatic delphinians needed precise humidity levels that the failing systems could no longer maintain. The crystalline students required specific mineral compositions in their air supply. The energy-based Luxians were flickering irregularly as the electromagnetic fields that supported their containment systems became unstable. Maya tried again to alert Academy administration, this time accessing emergency communication protocols. The system informed her that her communications were being logged for administrative review and that official updates would be provided through appropriate channels. The Atmospheric Processing Center was a cathedral of technology, filled with systems that represented the pinnacle of galactic environmental engineering. Atmospheric recyclers that could process the waste products of hundreds of different species and convert them back into breathable air. Filtration systems that could remove trace contaminants down to the molecular level. Environmental controls that could maintain perfect conditions for dozens of different atmospheric requirements simultaneously. All of it was failing in a cascade of errors that the automated repair systems could not resolve. Maya began running diagnostics using her multi-tool. The Academy's systems were far more advanced than anything she had ever worked with, but the basic principles of environmental engineering were universal. Air went in, got processed, came out clean. When the process broke down, you found the bottleneck and fixed it. The bottleneck, as it turned out, was in the organic filtration systems. The Academy's environmental processing used biological filters derived from organisms that had evolved on worlds where atmospheric composition was stable. These organisms were incredibly efficient at processing normal waste products under normal conditions, but they had no adaptation mechanisms for dealing with the kind of rapid environmental changes that were occurring during the cascade failure. The biological filters were dying, and as they died, they were releasing organic compounds that were overwhelming the chemical filtration systems. The chemical filters were becoming saturated and shutting down, which increased the load on the biological filters, which accelerated their death rate, which produced more organic compounds. It was, Maya realized, a perfect example of the kind of cascade failure that humans learned to recognize and interrupt, and that other species had never encountered. The solution was obvious to someone whose species had spent millennia dealing with biological systems under stress. You had to interrupt the cascade by giving the biological filters time to recover, which meant temporarily bypassing the normal filtration process and running the atmosphere through emergency scrubbing systems. Maya began manually rerouting the atmospheric flow through the Academy's emergency processing systems. These systems were designed to handle short-term atmospheric emergencies and were much less efficient than the normal biochemical processing, but they could maintain breathable air while the biological filters recovered. The process required shutting down normal atmospheric processing for the entire eastern wing and manually managing the transition to emergency systems. Maya worked through the procedure step by step, monitoring atmospheric readings throughout the wing and adjusting flow rates to maintain breathable air for all the affected species. It was while she was elbow-deep in the emergency atmospheric controls that Professor Kethvari found her. "Student Maya," Professor Kethvari said, her luminescent patterns flashing in what Maya now recognized as extreme agitation. "You are not authorized to be in this area. You must return to your room immediately." Maya looked up from the control panel where she was manually adjusting nitrogen compound filtration rates. "Professor, the automated systems are failing. The biological filters are dying in a cascade pattern. If we don't interrupt the cycle, atmospheric conditions throughout the wing will become toxic within a few hours. Professor Kethvari's patterns shifted to what Maya was learning indicated confusion. Student Maya, the Academy's automated systems are designed to handle all possible environmental emergencies. Administrative protocols are in effect. Students are required to remain in their rooms where they are safe while the systems resolve the issue. The systems can't resolve the issue, Maya said, continuing to work on the controls. The biological filters don't have adaptation mechanisms for cascade failures. The automated repair protocols are making the situation worse by trying to compensate instead of interrupting the cycle. Student Maya, you must stop what you are doing and return to your room immediately. You are interfering with Academy's safety protocols. Maya paused in her work and looked at Professor Kethvari. Professor, have you checked the atmospheric readings recently? Administrative protocols are handling all monitoring requirements. Professor, students in this wing are going to start suffocating in about 3 hours. Professor Kethvari's luminescent patterns became even more agitated. That is not possible. The Academy has maintained perfect safety for over 3,000 years. Our systems are designed to prevent any possibility of student injury. Maya accessed her multi-tool and displayed the real-time atmospheric readings for the Eastern Wing. Oxygen levels dropping, nitrogen compound concentrations rising, power consumption increasing as environmental controls worked harder to compensate for failing filtration systems. Professor Kethvari stared at the readings for several minutes, her patterns shifting through sequences that Maya could not interpret. This is not possible, Professor Kethvari said finally. It's happening, Maya said. And the manual override I've initiated is the only thing preventing it from getting worse. You have activated manual overrides? Student Maya, only authorized personnel are permitted to operate Academy environmental systems. Then, where are the authorized personnel? Professor Kethvari's pattern stopped shifting entirely, which Maya was beginning to recognize as the visual equivalent of shocked silence. The authorized personnel are in administrative meetings discussing the appropriate response to the environmental situation, Professor Kethvari said. While students suffocate, students are not suffocating. Students are safely in their rooms while administrative protocols manage the situation. Maya gestured at the control panel. Professor, I need to complete the transition to emergency processing systems. This will stabilize atmospheric conditions while the biological filters recover. But it requires manual monitoring for the next several hours to maintain proper balance for all the different species in the wing. Professor Kethvari looked at the control panel, at Maya, at the atmospheric readings, and back at the control panel. Student Maya, I do not understand how to operate these systems. Maya blinked. You don't know how to operate emergency environmental controls. These systems are designed to be automated. Manual operation is not part of standard training. What happens if the automation fails? Automation does not fail. The Academy has maintained perfect safety for over 3,000 years. Maya looked at the failing biological filters, the overwhelmed chemical processing systems, and the atmospheric readings that clearly indicated that automation was, in fact, failing. Professor, could you contact Dr. Vexthani or someone from engineering? I can stabilize the situation, but it would help to have official authorization for what I'm doing. Professor Kethvari activated her communication device and began a rapid conversation in her native language. Maya continued working on the environmental controls, monitoring atmospheric conditions throughout the wing and adjusting flow rates as the emergency processing systems came online. 20 minutes later, Dr. Vexthani arrived with a full team of Academy administrators and engineering personnel. Maya was sitting cross-legged on the floor next to the main control panel, her multi-tool connected to the Academy's systems, manually managing atmospheric processing for an entire wing of the Academy. Student Maya, Dr. Vexthani said, his 4 eyes blinking in rapid sequence. Please explain what you are doing. Maya looked up from the control readouts. I'm maintaining atmospheric balance for the Eastern Wing while the biological filtration systems recover from cascade failure. The emergency processing systems are handling basic air scrubbing, but they need manual adjustment to accommodate the different atmospheric requirements of all the species in the wing. Dr. Vexthani looked at the engineering team, who began running their own diagnostics on the environmental systems. After several minutes of rapid consultation, the head of engineering approached Dr. Vexthani and spoke to him in urgent, hushed tones. "Student Maya, Dr. Vexthani said finally, "Our engineering team confirms that you have correctly identified the source of the environmental processing failure and that your manual intervention has prevented what would have been a serious emergency. It still will be a serious emergency if we don't maintain manual control until the biological filters recover," Maya said. "The emergency systems can't handle the load indefinitely, and the automated controls will just restart the cascade failure if we return to normal processing too soon." Dr. Vexthani's respiratory slits were fluttering rapidly. "Student Maya, how did you learn to operate Academy environmental systems?" "I didn't, but I know how biological filtration works, and I know what cascade failure looks like, and I know how to read atmospheric monitoring data. The Academy systems are more advanced than anything we have on Earth, but the basic principles are the same." "And how did you gain access to Academy environmental controls?" Maya held up her multi-tool. "Emergency override. The Academy's security protocols are designed to keep people out of systems they shouldn't mess with, but they include emergency provisions for situations where immediate action is necessary to prevent injury or death." The engineering team was now engaged in intensive study of Maya's modifications to the environmental systems. Dr. Vexthani waited for their assessment before speaking again. "Student Maya, our engineering team reports that your modifications to Academy systems are effective. However, they also report that your approach to environmental management involves accepting temporary degradation of optimal conditions in order to prevent total system failure. Right? You have to choose between suboptimal conditions that everyone can survive and optimal conditions that collapse when the system can't maintain them. This is not how our systems are designed to operate. I noticed. Your systems are designed for stable conditions and predictable loads. When conditions become unstable and loads become unpredictable, the design assumptions break down." Dr. Vexthani was quiet for several minutes while the engineering team continued their analysis. Finally, he spoke again. "Student Maya, Academy protocols require that we conduct a full investigation of this incident. However, it appears that your unauthorized intervention may have prevented serious injury to students in the Eastern Wing. Does this mean I'm in trouble? Student Maya, you have violated numerous Academy safety protocols, accessed systems without authorization, and operated critical infrastructure without proper training or supervision." Maya waited. "You have also demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that appear to be outside the normal range of galactic educational standards," Dr. Vexthani continued. "And you have identified failure modes in Academy systems that our engineering team had not previously considered. So, am I in trouble?" Dr. Vexthani's 4 eyes blinked in sequence again. "Student Maya, I believe we need to have a much longer conversation about your educational experience at this academy." As the engineering team took over manual control of the atmospheric systems and began implementing longer-term solutions to the biological filter cascade failure, Maya gathered her things and prepared to return to her dormitory. The crisis had been resolved, the students in the Eastern Wing were safe, and normal operations would resume within a few hours. But, as Maya walked through the corridors of the academy, she noticed that word of the incident had spread. Students watched her with expressions that had shifted from curiosity and caution to something that looked like recognition. Not recognition of who she was, but recognition of what she represented. For the first time in the galaxy's recorded history, a student had identified and resolved a critical safety emergency that the Academy's automated systems could not handle. More importantly, she had done it by applying approaches to problem-solving that were completely foreign to galactic civilization, accepting temporary degradation to prevent total failure, manually overriding automated systems, taking individual action in response to collective danger. Maya returned to her room and sat by the window, looking out at the Academy grounds. Tomorrow, she had advanced engineering and interspecies relations. She wondered if her professors were prepared for lessons from someone whose species had never had the luxury of assuming that their systems would always work, their environments would always be stable, or their safety would always be guaranteed by someone else. Outside her window, the academy settled into another evening, no longer quite as peaceful as it had been, and no longer quite as certain that perfect safety was possible in a universe where everything, eventually, changed.